She didn't plan to be brave. She didn't even plan to be noticed. Cassie was just a waitress counting minutes until her shift ended, wiping wine glasses that cost more than her monthly rent. When she saw it, the faint glint in the glass across the street, a reflection that didn't belong, a pause that lasted half a second too long. At table 12 sat a man everyone else pretended not to recognize. Expensive suit, calm hands, the kind of presence that bent the room around him. Cassie didn't know his name yet, only the feeling crawling up her spine, screaming that something was wrong. She had 10 seconds. 10 seconds to walk away and stay invisible, or 10 seconds to ruin her life. So she wrote a message on a receipt and slid it beside his drink, pretending it was the bill. From a distance, it looked harmless. Up close, it was a warning, because if that man looked up, he wouldn't hear the shot coming. And if he survived, Cassie wouldn't walk out of that restaurant the same person ever again. The first time Cassie Harper saw Dante Russo, she was already lying to him. Not with words she hadn't spoken a single syllable yet, but with the performance she'd mastered since she was 19, the perfect smile, the soft voice, the careful steps between tables that belonged to people who would never remember her name. On the surface, she was just another waitress in a restaurant that smelled like truffle butter and old money. Underneath, she was a girl who had learned to live quietly because quiet kept you safe. And yet, that night, safety had already been stolen from her. The twist came before she even reached his table. 20 minutes earlier, Cassie had been in the last stall of the women's restroom, phone in hand during her 5-minute break, scrolling mindlessly through messages from her landlord and a missed call she couldn't afford to return. The door had swung open with a decisive snap. Red-soled heels clicked across marble like punctuation marks in a sentence Cassie didn't want to read. A woman's perfume hit first sharp, expensive, designed to be remembered. She didn't know Cassie was in the stall, or maybe she did. Either way, she didn't lower her voice. "I don't care who he is," the woman said, a smile in her tone that didn't reach kindness. "Tonight, he bleeds. And if the little waitress gets in the way, she bleeds too." Cassie's blood had turned to ice. Little waitress. There weren't that many women in this restaurant, and Cassie had been working the floor all evening. She should have frozen. She should have stayed invisible. She should have waited for the woman to leave and then told her manager, told security, told anyone with authority and distance from danger. Instead, Cassie had done what she always did when fear tried to make her small. She listened. A second voice murmured male, low, impatient. Cassie caught fragments window, timing, across the street, one shot, and then the woman again, amused, cruel. He won't even see it coming. When the restroom door closed, Cassie sat there a moment longer, palms damp, heart punching against her ribs. Her mind raced through options like a desperate roulette wheel. Tell the manager. He'd laugh or panic, call 911. Too slow, too loud. Go back to the dining room and point at a stranger. She could get fired, humiliated, ignored, and if she was wrong, she'd become the kind of drama the rich people complained about over dessert. But Cassie hadn't imagined the words little waitress. She hadn't imagined the certainty behind them. She washed her hands longer than necessary, not to clean them, but to anchor herself. In the mirror, her face looked paler than usual, eyes too wide. "Don't do this," she whispered, as if her reflection might be wiser than her. "Don't be stupid." Then she stepped back onto the floor. Aurelio's dining room glittered with crystal and low laughter. The skyline outside the glass walls was Manhattan at midnight cold, bright, indifferent. Cassie's tray felt heavier than it should have, as if fear had weight. She moved on instinct, weaving between tables, delivering drinks, smiling at jokes that weren't funny. She kept her gaze down because that was her job. But the feeling in her spine insisted on looking up. Table 12 was near the glass, the best view in the place. A man sat there with the kind of stillness that turned air into pressure. Not large in the obvious way, no theatrics. No loud presence, just control, worn like a tailored suit. A crystal tumbler sat near his hand. The amber liquid inside barely trembled when he lifted it. His girlfriend, if that's what she was, laughed too brightly at something on her phone, sound sharp against the restaurant's velvet hum. She was beautiful in the polished way wealth could buy. Cassie had seen her type before, the woman who acted fearless because she'd never been truly afraid. But the man beside her was different. Dante Russo didn't need to announce himself. He was announced by how the staff moved around him, too careful, too efficient. By the way security stood at angles that weren't accidental. Broad shoulders and discreet earpieces disguised as chic tech. By the subtle widening of space, as if the people nearby sensed a storm and instinctively stepped back. Cassie didn't know his name yet. She just knew, with a certainty that felt like a curse, that he was the target. She approached, pulse trying to claw out of her throat. "Any dessert for you and your guest tonight?" "Sir?" she asked, voice steady because she forced it to be. Dante's gaze lifted to hers. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't even interest. Not in the way men usually looked at women in places like this. It was assessment, cold, precise, the kind of attention that didn't flatter so much as expose. Cassie felt seen in a way she didn't like, as if he could measure every weakness she tried to hide. "We'll skip dessert," he said. His voice was smooth as the whiskey in his glass. "But I'll need a moment with the manager." His gaze stayed on Cassie. "And with you." Her stomach dropped. "Of course, sir. I can get stay," he murmured. The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Something in the tone made the fine hairs at the back of Cassie's neck rise. It was an order and a warning in one. He had heard something, noticed something. Or maybe he simply controlled every variable in every room he entered. And then Cassie saw it. Not the shooter, not the weapon, just the smallest flicker in the glass behind him. A glint from the building across the street, exactly where Cassie had seen it during her break. The reflection shifted, precise and deliberate, like someone adjusting a scope. 10 seconds. Cassie's mind turned terrifyingly clear. If she screamed, the restaurant would erupt and the target would become chaos. If she did nothing, Dante Russo would be dead and Cassie would carry the sound of that shot forever. If she warned him out loud, he might look up exactly what the shooter needed. Her hands moved before her fear could stop them. Cassie slid a small receipt from her pocket, borrowed from the station by the kitchen. Her pen scratched paper so fast the ink smeared under her trembling fingers. She folded it once, then again, making it look like a bill. She placed it on the white linen beside his tumbler with the practiced ease of someone delivering a check. From a distance, it looked harmless. Up close, if he actually read it, it was a death sentence for him, for her, or for both. "Don't look up." Across the street, one shot. Cassie tried to step back. Dante's fingers brushed the paper. Not hurried, not startled. His eyes didn't flick to the window. They didn't flick anywhere. He unfolded the receipt beneath the table, out of sight. He read, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not surprise, but a quiet recalibration, as if the universe had handed him a new piece of information, and he was immediately deciding what to do with it. His gaze returned to Cassie. "Stay," he said again, softer. Cassie wanted to run. Every survival instinct screamed at her to move, to duck, to become invisible again. But the word anchored her as surely as a hand around her wrist. She stayed because she had already chosen this. She stayed because leaving now would feel like betrayal. The shot came like a crack in the fabric of the world. Glass exploded inward. The sound was sharp, obscene, louder than any scream. Cassie dropped the tray and lunged pure reflex. No thought. Her shoulder slammed into Dante hard enough to knock him sideways as the bullet punched through the window exactly where his head had been a heartbeat before. His girlfriend screamed. The restaurant erupted into chaos, chairs scraping, people shouting, someone crying. Security moved like a wall, guns appearing from nowhere. Cassie hit the carpet, the expensive fibers rough against her cheek, smelling of wine and panic. A heavy weight pinned her, not crushing, but deliberate. Cassie twisted her head and found Dante covering her. One hand braced on the floor, the other gripping her wrist so tightly she could feel her pulse hammering against his fingers. His suit was dusted with glass. A thin line of blood streaked his cheekbone. "Don't move," he said. His voice was close enough to feel against her skin, low enough that it cut through the chaos like a blade. Cassie's breathing came too fast. Her heart was trying to break out of her ribs. She wanted to ask if he was alive. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to say she hadn't planned any of this. But the truth was uglier and simpler she had planned it. She had walked toward danger with her eyes open because she couldn't do otherwise. The moment stretched. Then, gradually, the sound shifted sirens in the distance. Urgent footsteps. Shouted orders. Security formed a shield around Dante. Someone yanked Cassie upright too roughly. Another hand checked her arms, her shoulders, her head as if she might be hiding a wound. Cassie's knees shook. She tried to stand like she hadn't just met death in a dining room full of chandeliers. Dante rose, calm in the middle of a storm. He looked out at the shattered window, then at his security, barking short commands. Everything about him said he had lived through this before. That danger wasn't new. It was familiar, like an old enemy he knew how to greet. Then his gaze found Cassie again. It wasn't the same as before. Before, he'd looked at her like a variable, a stranger, someone he could dismiss. Now he looked at her like a complication the universe had personally delivered to him. Cassie swallowed, throat dry. She realized her hands were still trembling. She tried to hide it by curling her fingers into a fist. It didn't help. Dante stepped closer. The noise around them muffled, as if the world itself held its breath to listen. "What's your name?" he asked. Cassie's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. She had served hundreds of men who never cared to know. Men who snapped fingers. Men who stared at her chest. Men who threw money at problems and expected the world to bow. This man didn't snap. He didn't leer. He didn't need to. He simply asked. And Cassie felt the question land with the weight of a verdict. Cassie. She managed. Cassie Harper. Dante repeated it once, like tasting it. Cassie. She should have felt relieved. She should have felt proud. Even she had saved him. She had done something that mattered. Instead, Cassie felt the floor tilt, because Dante Russo's eyes had changed. And with that change came a realization that struck her harder than the gunshot saving him didn't make her safe. It made her visible. It made her attached to him in a way she didn't understand yet. His gaze dropped to her wrist, where his fingers had left faint red marks, then back to her face. "You saw it," he said. Not a question. Cassie forced herself to nod. Yes, I saw something." Dante's jaw tightened. In the background, someone was shouting for everyone to stay put. A manager was sobbing. Cassie's coworkers looked terrified. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. Probably her landlord again. Still unaware that Cassie's life had just split into before and after. Dante leaned in slightly, just enough that his voice became a private thread between them. "You did the right thing," he said. Cassie almost laughed, because the words sounded absurd in a room full of shattered glass and screaming people. The right thing didn't usually come with sirens. Then, softer. So soft, she wondered if she'd imagined it. He added, "But you also just made yourself a target." Cassie's breath caught. She tried to step back, instinctively putting distance between them. But one of Dante's men shifted into her path, not threatening, just present, containing. Cassie looked at Dante, panic sharpening her voice. "I have to go. I have my brother." The word brother changed something in Dante's face. Not sympathy, not softness. Something colder and more decisive. "How old?" he asked. Cassie blinked. 13? "Jake. He's home alone." Dante's gaze flicked to his security chief. A single nod. A phone already in hand. Words being typed too fast for Cassie to follow. "No," Cassie said immediately, fear turning to anger. "Don't." "You can't." Dante's eyes locked on hers. And Cassie felt the full gravity of him. The kind of man who moved pieces on boards the rest of the city didn't even know existed. "I can," he said. "And I will." Cassie's voice shook. "You don't know me." His mouth curved, not a smile. Not really. More like recognition. "I know enough." Then he stepped closer again. Close enough that Cassie could see the tiny flecks of glass caught in his hair, the thin cut on his cheekbone, the controlled steadiness in his pupils. Close enough that she could smell whiskey and winter air, and something darker beneath it danger made human. In that instant, Cassie understood the real twist of her night. The bullet had missed him, but it had hit her life perfectly. Dante Russo's gaze held hers, unblinking, as if he could see the next moves already lined up, as if her choices were narrowing with every second she stood in front of him. And somewhere deep in his mind, Dante already had an answer to the question he'd asked out loud. Cassie Harper wasn't just a waitress. She was a problem. A precious one. A dangerous one. And Dante Russo had never been the kind of man who walked away from problems, especially not the ones that had saved his life. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. Cassie did not remember leaving the restaurant. Later, fragments would return to her in disjointed flashes, the sting of cold night air on her face, the violent red and blue pulse of police lights against glass, the sound of her own breathing too loud in her ears. What she remembered most clearly was the way Dante Russo's presence reorganized the chaos around him, as if disorder itself bent to his will. She was guided, steered through a service exit she had used 100 times and never once considered dangerous. Tonight, it felt like a one-way door. Behind her, Aurelio dissolved into sirens and shouting, into questions she could not answer and explanations she did not have the words for. Ahead of her waited a black SUV with tinted windows and a man who didn't smile when he opened the door. "Get in," he said, not unkindly, but without room for refusal. Cassie stopped short. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Fear pressed against her ribs, but anger had slipped in beside it, sharp and insistent. "I saved his life. That doesn't mean I belong to him." The man hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Dante stood a few steps back, speaking quietly into his phone. He ended the call and looked at Cassie again, that same measuring calm in his eyes. "No one said you belong to me," he replied, "but you don't belong out here anymore either." Cassie shook her head. "You don't get to decide that." His gaze sharpened, not cruel, not angry, simply focused. "Someone already has," he said. "And they don't care whether you live long enough to argue?" That sentence landed harder than any threat. Cassie's mouth opened, then closed. The world had tilted since the moment she'd slid that note across the table. But this was the first time she understood the shape of the fall. "I have to go home," she said. "My brother is alone." The word brother changed the air between them. Dante didn't ask her to repeat herself. He didn't question her. He just nodded once and lifted his phone again. Cassie watched his thumb move, fast and decisive. Too decisive. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Making sure your brother isn't—" Dante said, eyes still on the screen, still alone. The panic hit then, sharp and dizzying. "You can't just send people to my apartment," Cassie snapped. "You don't know him? You don't know me?" Dante finally looked up. "That's exactly why I'm sending them," he said. "Because whoever planned tonight will learn who you are. And once they do, they'll start with the leverage." Cassie felt the ground shift under her feet. "He's 13?" she whispered. Dante's expression didn't soften, but something in it recalibrated. "Then we don't waste time." By the time Cassie realized arguing would only slow things down, she was already inside the SUV. The door closed with a final, muffled thud that sounded uncomfortably like a verdict. The city slid past the windows in streaks of light, familiar streets suddenly foreign, as if she were seeing Manhattan from the wrong side of the glass. Dante sat across from her, close enough now that Cassie could see the fine cut along his cheekbone, already beginning to clot. Glass glittered faintly in his dark hair. He looked untouched by the violence of the night, as if chaos were merely another language he spoke fluently. "Tell me everything you heard," he said. Cassie folded her hands together to keep them from shaking. She recounted the bathroom, the woman's voice, the fragments of conversation. Dante listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, absorbing details the way other men absorbed compliments. When she finished, silence filled the car. "You did more than hear," he said finally. "You understood." "I didn't want to," Cassie replied. "That doesn't matter." The SUV slowed, then turned. Tall iron gates slid open, revealing a building that looked less like a house and more like a statement stone, steel, and discretion woven together. The Gramercy House, Dante called it, though Cassie would later realize it was less a home than a fortress designed to look civilized. Inside, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Cassie's footsteps echoed softly as she followed Dante through wide corridors, lit by warm, indirect light. The luxury was deliberate, restrained. Nothing here existed to impress. It existed to endure. A man approached Dante and spoke in a low voice. Cassie caught only pieces picked up. Safe, scared, but unharmed. Her breath left her all at once. Jake. Dante nodded. He's with people I trust. He'll be brought here tonight. Relief crashed into her so suddenly her knees weakened. She pressed her hand against the wall, grounding herself. For a moment, she hated Dante for how easily he had taken control of something so precious to her, for how much she needed the power he wielded. You should hate me for that, Dante said, watching her closely. Cassie laughed once, breathless and bitter. I don't even know what I feel. That's honest, he replied. You'll need honesty if you're going to survive this. She looked up at him then, really looked. Not the myth, not the man from headlines she hadn't read, but the one standing in front of her, dangerous, composed, undeniably real. I never asked for any of this. No, Dante agreed. But you chose it. The words stung because they were true. A few minutes later, Cassie sat on the edge of a leather sofa, a glass of water untouched in her hands. Dante stood nearby, speaking with his security team, issuing instructions that sounded like chess moves. When he finally dismissed them, the house seemed to exhale. You can leave in the morning, he said, turning back to her. Once we know who's behind this? And until then, Cassie asked. Until then, Dante replied. You stay where I can see you. Cassie met his gaze, defiance flickering weakly under exhaustion. I'm not a prisoner. No, he said. You're a witness. The distinction did little to comfort her. When Jake arrived later that night, wide-eyed, shaken but unharmed, Cassie finally allowed herself to cry. She held her brother tightly, murmuring reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. Dante watched from a distance, giving them space he didn't give easily. As the night stretched on and exhaustion dulled the sharpest edges of fear, Cassie began to understand the deeper truth she'd been circling since the gunshot. Saving Dante Russo hadn't made her brave or important or heroic. It had made her visible. And visibility, in Dante's world, was the most dangerous thing of all. Morning arrived quietly at the Gramercy house. As if the night before had been a rumor the walls refused to repeat. Pale light filtered through tall windows, touching polished stone and dark wood with deceptive gentleness. Cassie woke on a couch that was too soft, too expensive, her body stiff with the memory of fear that hadn't fully loosened its grip. For a few seconds, she didn't remember where she was. Then she heard Jake's breathing nearby slow, even, and reality settled back into place. He lay curled under a blanket on the opposite sofa, his face peaceful in a way that felt undeserved after everything that had happened. Cassie watched him longer than necessary, memorizing the rise and fall of his chest, the small crease between his brows that appeared even in sleep. Only then did she allow herself to sit up. The house felt different in daylight, less like a fortress, more like a carefully curated illusion of normalcy. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city moved on without them. Cassie wondered how many people woke up that morning, unaware that her life had tilted off its axis the night before. She found Dante in the kitchen. He stood at the counter in a rolled-sleeve shirt that looked far too casual for a man like him. Dark hair slightly disordered, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. He looked up as she entered, gaze flicking instinctively to the hallway behind her before returning to her face. Your brother's still asleep, Cassie said. I know, Dante replied. I had someone check on him. The words were efficient, controlled. They should have reassured her. Instead, they tightened something in her chest. You don't need to keep doing that, Cassie said carefully. Watching, managing. Dante studied her for a moment, as if recalculating. That depends on what you think last night changed. Cassie crossed her arms, grounding herself in the familiar defensive gesture. It changed everything, she said. And nothing. I'm still me. He's still my responsibility, and I didn't agree to live by your rules. A faint curve touched Dante's mouth, not amusement. Exactly, but interest. You're assuming I have rules you can agree to. That's not reassuring. He took a slow sip of his coffee. You stayed? I didn't have a choice, You always have a choice, Dante said. You just don't always like the options. Cassie bristled. Don't talk to me like I'm naive. You decided things for me last night. You sent people to my apartment. You moved my brother without asking. You didn't even tell me where we were going. And he's alive, Dante said calmly. Unharmed. Still yours. The truth of that silenced her. If only for a moment. Cassie hated that he was right. Hated even more that part of her was grateful. That doesn't make it okay, she said finally. No, Dante agreed. It makes it necessary. The words settled heavily between them. Cassie turned away, pacing toward the window. Outside, the city looked deceptively ordinary. Cars moved. People walked. Somewhere, someone complained about a late train or burnt coffee, unaware that Cassie Harper was standing in a stranger's kitchen arguing with a man who could end her life with a sentence. What happens now, she asked. Dante set the cup down. Now we find out who ordered the shot. And me, Cassie pressed. Dante's gaze followed her reflection in the glass. Now you're a variable. She turned back sharply. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one, he replied. You're not a target by design. You're collateral that became inconveniently aware. Cassie's hands curled into fists. You make it sound like an equation. That's because it is, Dante said quietly. And you disrupted it. The air shifted, something unspoken moving beneath the surface. Cassie realized, with a jolt, that Dante wasn't angry with her. He wasn't even annoyed. He was unsettled. She had done something his world wasn't built to accommodate, acted without permission, without leverage, without fear of consequence. She straightened, meeting his gaze head-on. I won't be used. Dante considered her. Then don't be. The simplicity of the response threw her. It's not that easy. No, he said, but it's possible. You set terms, you hold them. You don't let anyone, including me, decide for you. Cassie let out a short laugh. That sounds generous for someone like you. It's pragmatic, Dante replied. People who feel trapped make unpredictable choices. I prefer predictability. So you want me comfortable, Cassie said slowly. Not safe. Comfortable. Dante's eyes darkened slightly. Comfort is the beginning of control. The honesty of it sent a chill through her. Cassie looked away again, this time toward the hallway where Jake slept. I'll stay, she said. For now. But I have conditions. Dante waited. I keep my job. Cassie continued. When this is over, I go back to my life. You don't touch my brother without telling me. You don't make decisions for me behind my back. And if I decide that doing so keeps you alive, Dante asked. Cassie met his gaze steadily. Then you tell me first. And you let me choose. For a long moment. Dante said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. Cassie wondered if she had overplayed her hand, if she had misunderstood the fragile leverage she held simply by existing in his line of sight. Finally, Dante nodded. Agreed. The word felt like a promise, and Cassie was not naive enough to trust it blindly. Still, something loosened in her chest. Later that afternoon, Cassie ventured into the house's library, a quiet room lined with shelves she had no intention of reading. Dante joined her there, standing a little too close, his presence an undeniable pressure. He watched her trace a finger along a book's spine, an oddly domestic image that felt surreal given the circumstances. You don't belong here, he said, not unkindly. Cassie glanced up. Neither do you. His mouth curved faintly. I belong exactly where I am. She studied him then, noticing the controlled stillness, the weight of responsibility that clung to him like a shadow. Does it ever get tiring? She asked. Being the man everyone's afraid of, Dante considered the question. Fear is efficient, he said. It keeps people honest. And you? Cassie asked softly. Who keeps you honest for the first time since she'd met him? Dante looked away. The moment passed quickly, but it lingered in Cassie's mind. She was beginning to understand that Dante Russo was not simply dangerous because of what he could do, but because of how easily he accepted it. And somehow, impossibly, she had become part of the equation he could not quite solve. That night, As Cassie lay awake listening to the unfamiliar quiet of the house, she realized the truth she had been avoiding all day. Staying was dangerous. Leaving would be worse. And somewhere between those two truths, something else was beginning to form. Something fragile, complicated, and entirely unwelcome. She had drawn a line with a man who didn't believe in limits. And Dante Russo, she suspected, was already deciding how far he was willing to cross it. By the third day, Cassie began to understand that the Gramercy house did not sleep. It breathed. Quietly. Methodically. Men rotated through unseen corridors. Voices murmured behind doors that never quite closed. And information moved faster than sound. The city outside continued as if nothing had happened. But inside these walls, time bent around Dante Russo's priorities. Cassie returned to work that afternoon, exactly as she'd insisted. Dante hadn't argued. He hadn't smiled either. He had simply watched her pull on her jacket, watched the way resolve settled into her shoulders, and said, "I'll have someone drive you. I'm not fragile," she replied. "No," Dante said evenly. "You're visible." The drive to the restaurant felt unreal. Aurelio had replaced the shattered glass, polished the floors, lowered the lights. Fear had been cleaned up like a spill. Her coworkers stared too long, spoke too carefully. No one asked questions, which was worse than if they had. Cassie moved through her shift with practiced precision, her body remembering what her mind refused to forget. Every reflection felt suspect. Every pause carried weight. When she returned to the Gramercy house that night, Dante was waiting. He didn't greet her. He didn't offer a drink. He handed her a phone instead. "Detective Ramos," he said. "She wants to speak with you tomorrow morning, Midtown South." 10 a.m.? Cassie's stomach tightened. "About the shooting." "Yes." "And you," she asked. "I won't be there." That stopped her. Why Dante's gaze didn't waver? Because the truth is more believable when I'm not in the room. Cassie understood the calculation instantly, and the understanding hurt. "You're letting them question me alone. I'm letting you speak for yourself," Dante corrected. "You said you didn't want decisions made for you." She looked down at the phone, its smooth surface suddenly heavy. "What if I say the wrong thing?" "You won't," Dante said. "You're careful. You listen. And you know when to stop. You're very confident," Cassie said quietly. "I have to be." She met his eyes. "You're not telling me something." The smallest hesitation flickered across Dante's expression. It was gone almost before she could name it, but she caught it. "Not yet," he said. "It wouldn't help you tomorrow." Cassie exhaled slowly, forcing her voice steady. "I don't like that." "I know." That night, sleep refused to come easily. Cassie lay awake listening to Jake's soft breathing in the next room, the steady presence that anchored her to something real. She thought about Detective Ramos, about interrogation rooms and questions that cut sideways. She thought about Dante's silence, about the weight of what he chose not to share. Somewhere between fear and exhaustion, she decided something else too if she was going to be pulled into this world. She would not arrive blindfolded. The precinct smelled like disinfectant and old paper. Detective Sarah Ramos was sharper than Cassie expected direct eyes, precise posture, a voice that wasted no words. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She simply asked Cassie to tell the story again, and again, and again. Cassie stuck to facts. The bathroom, the voices, the note, the shot. She left out Dante's house, his men, the quiet efficiency with which he rearranged reality. Ramos listened, occasionally interrupting with a question that felt almost casual. Cassie answered carefully, choosing honesty over embellishment, restraint over fear. Halfway through, Ramos leaned back. "You know who he is," she said. Cassie didn't pretend confusion. "I know what people say, and you still warned him." Cassie met her gaze. "I warned a man who was about to be killed." Ramos studied her for a long moment. "People who get close to Dante Russo tend to disappear," she said, sometimes quietly, sometimes not. Cassie's pulse ticked faster, but she kept her voice even. "I'm still here." "For now," Ramos replied. "Be careful which side you think you're on." When Cassie returned to the Gramercy house, she found Dante in the study, jacket off, sleeves rolled, speaking softly into his phone. He ended the call as she entered, attention snapping fully to her. How did it go? She's smart, Cassie said. She doesn't trust me. She shouldn't, Dante replied. Cassie stepped closer. The space between them charged. You knew she'd say that. Yes. You let me walk into that knowing I'd be pressured, Cassie said, anger threading through her words. Knowing I'd be used. Dante didn't deny it. I let you walk in knowing you'd survive it. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed, Ed. It isn't. The admission unsettled her more than an excuse would have. Cassie searched his face, looking for regret, for reassurance. What she found was something harder to name conflict, restrained and unresolved. You're playing a longer game, she said. I don't know how to play short ones, Dante replied. Cassie's laugh was soft, brittle. You're very good at justifying this. I'm very good at living with the consequences. And what about me, she asked. Am I a consequence you're prepared for? The question hung between them, sharp and dangerous. Dante took a step closer, close enough that Cassie could feel the warmth of him, the quiet gravity that drew everything inward. You shouldn't be here, he said, echoing his words from before. And yet you are. Cassie held his gaze. So are you. Something shifted then, subtle, undeniable. Not desire, not yet. Recognition. Dante was no longer seeing her as collateral or variable or witness. He was seeing her as a choice, one that complicated every calculation he made. Later, alone in her room, Cassie replayed the day in her mind. She had faced the police and returned standing. She had confronted Dante and been met with honesty, however incomplete. The truth settled slowly. Heavily staying had a price. Not staying would cost more. She lay back, staring at the ceiling, aware of the line she was walking and how easily it could disappear beneath her feet. Somewhere in the house, Dante Russo moved through rooms designed to keep him in control. And for the first time since she'd written that note, Cassie realized something that frightened her more than the gunshot ever had. She wasn't just surviving Dante's world anymore. She was starting to matter within it. Cassie began to sense the shift before anyone said a word. It arrived quietly, like pressure in the air before a storm, subtle enough to be dismissed if she hadn't learned to listen for danger. Men moved differently through the Gramercy house, now faster, more alert. Conversations ended when she entered a room. Phones buzzed more often, then went silent. Dante's world was tightening, drawing lines she could feel but not yet see. He didn't warn her. That was the first mistake. The second came 3 nights later, when Cassie noticed the car parked across the street from the bookstore where she worked. It wasn't obvious, no dark windows, no idling engine, but it was there when she arrived, and still there when she left. The man inside never looked at her directly. He didn't need to. Cassie felt the attention like a hand at her back. When she told Dante that night, he listened without interruption. He asked for the color of the car, the plate, the man's posture. He nodded once and said, "I'll handle it." That should have reassured her. Instead, it left her cold. Handle it how Cassie asked. Dante met her gaze. Unreadable. Quickly, she waited for more. None came. Days passed. The car disappeared. Another took its place. Then another. Subtle changes. A shadow here. A pause there. Cassie started varying her routes, watching reflections, memorizing exits. Jake noticed too, though he didn't say much, only asked once if they were safe. Cassie lied and said yes. The lie cracked the night Dante didn't come home. She woke just after midnight to the sound of voices below her window. Low, urgent. She slipped from bed and crossed the room, peering through the curtains. Men stood in the courtyard, faces tense, hands not quite steady. One of them looked up and caught her silhouette. Minutes later, Dante was in her doorway. He looked tired in a way Cassie had never seen before. Not physically, he still moved with the same controlled grace, but something in his eyes was frayed, stretched thin by decisions that had no clean outcomes. What happened, she asked. Dante closed the door behind him. A deal went sideways. Her chest tightened. Because of me. He didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Cassie stepped closer. You said you wouldn't decide things without telling me. I didn't decide, Dante said quietly. I adapted to what she pressed. To the fact that someone decided you were the most efficient way to get to me? The words landed like a blow. Cassie felt heat rise behind her eyes, anger mixing with something sharper heard. So it's true, she said. I'm leverage. Dante's jaw tightened. You're more than that. That's not what your enemies think, Cassie shot back. And it's not what your choices say. Silence stretched between them, thick and dangerous. Dante took a step toward her, then stopped, as if recognizing the distance for what it was. I made a call tonight, he said, one that protected you. At what cost? Dante held her gaze. At the cost of something I was willing to lose. Cassie's breath caught. You traded something. Yes. You used me, she said softly. No, Dante replied, just as soft. I protected you without asking whether you'd approve. And that's worse. The admission stunned her. Cassie searched his face, looking for deflection, for justification. Instead, she found something raw and restrained, as if Dante were holding himself together by will alone. You promised, she said. I know. And you broke it. Yes. The truth settled heavily between them. Cassie realized then that this was the line she'd been approaching since the night of the shooting, the one she'd pretended not to see. Loving Dante Russo, caring for him, trusting him meant existing in a space where her safety would always be weighed against his power, and he would always choose survival over consent. I can't do this, she said. Dante's gaze sharpened. You can. I won't, Cassie corrected. Her voice trembled. But she didn't stop. I won't be the reason you justify becoming worse. I won't be the excuse you use when you cross lines. Dante stepped closer then, close enough that Cassie could feel the heat of him, the pull that had been building between them for days, unspoken but undeniable. You think leaving fixes this? He asked. You think distance makes you safe? I think staying makes me complicit, Cassie said. And I won't be that. For a long moment, Dante said nothing. The silence was louder than any argument. Cassie wondered if he would stop her, if he would remind her of danger, of consequences, of how small she was compared to the world he controlled. Instead, he nodded once. I won't keep you here, he said, but you leave with protection. Cassie shook her head. No shadows, no watchers. You won't see them, Dante replied. That's the same thing. A flicker of something frustration. Fear crossed his face. You don't understand what you're walking into. Cassie met his gaze steadily. I understand exactly what I'm walking away from. She packed before dawn. Not much, just clothes, a few books, the quiet remnants of a life she'd almost lost. Jake watched her with worried eyes, asking questions she didn't have answers for. She told him they were going somewhere else for a while. She didn't tell him why. Dante watched from the doorway as she zipped the bag closed. This isn't over, he said. Cassie paused, hand on the zipper. It is for me. She hesitated then, just for a second, letting herself feel the pull she'd been resisting. The man who had shielded her with his body, the man who had broken his own rules for her, the man who would never stop being dangerous, no matter how softly he looked at her. I didn't fall for the power, she said quietly. I fell for the moments you weren't using it. Dante's expression shifted, something painful and unreadable passing through his eyes. That's the part of me that will get you killed. Or save you. Cassie replied. She didn't look back as she left. From the street, the Gramercy house looked exactly as it always had, imposing, silent, untouched. Cassie loaded the car, settled Jake inside, and drove away as the city woke around them. Her heart hammered painfully, grief and relief tangling together until she couldn't tell them apart. What she didn't see was the man across the street lowering his phone after taking a picture, or the message sent seconds later, precise and satisfied. She's alone now, and for the first time since Cassie Harper had written a warning on a receipt, Dante Russo realized the most dangerous truth of all: losing her didn't make him safer. It made him reckless. Cassie learned quickly that distance did not mean freedom. It only changed the shape of the danger. The first place she took Jake was a modest hotel on the edge of Queens, chosen for its anonymity rather than comfort. She paid cash. She asked for a room facing the courtyard. She kept the television on at low volume all night, not for noise, but for company, for the illusion that the world was still ordinary. Jake fell asleep easily, exhaustion claiming him the way only children could manage. Cassie did not sleep at all. By morning, the city felt different, not louder, sharper. Every sound carried intent. Every passing face seemed to linger a second too long. She told herself she was imagining it. Trauma had a way of rewriting patterns, turning coincidence into threat. She repeated that to herself as she walked Jake to a nearby diner for breakfast, as she watched him stir sugar into his coffee with careful concentration, as she smiled at the waitress and ordered pancakes like this was just another day. The man at the counter didn't look at her. That was the problem. He didn't look when she entered. Didn't look when she sat. Didn't look when Jake laughed at something on his phone. But when Cassie stood to pay, she saw his reflection in the chrome coffee machine, eyes lifted, assessing, memorizing. Her hand tightened around her wallet. They made it back to the hotel without incident. Cassie locked the door behind them and leaned against it, heart racing. "We're going to lie low today," she told Jake. "Movies, room service." Jake frowned. "Are we in trouble?" Cassie forced a smile. "No, just being careful." It was almost enough to convince him. Almost enough to convince her. The call came just after noon. Cassie didn't recognize the number. She answered anyway. "Ms. Harper," a man's voice said smoothly. "You've made an interesting choice." Her stomach dropped. "Who is this?" "Someone who appreciates efficiency," he replied. "You removed yourself from Mr. Russo's protection. That was considerate of you." Cassie's pulse thundered. "If you're calling to threaten me, I'm calling to invite you," the man interrupted lightly. "Coffee. A conversation. You deserve to know why your life is suddenly worth so much attention." Cassie glanced toward Jake, who was sprawled on the bed, half asleep in front of the television. "I'm not interested." A pause. Then, calmly, "Check the hallway camera." Her blood ran cold. Cassie crossed to the monitor by the door. The grainy feed showed the corridor outside their room. Empty. Then, a door down the hall opened. A man stepped out, speaking quietly into his phone. He looked up and smiled directly at the camera. "An hour," the voice on the line said. "Bring your brother. Or don't. Either way, we'll see you." The call ended. Cassie stood frozen, the weight of her choice crashing down on her all at once. Leaving Dante hadn't ended the game. It had escalated it. She packed quickly, hands shaking, mind racing through possibilities. Running again would only delay the inevitable. Staying put would end it. She woke Jake gently, told him they were meeting someone who could help them. She didn't tell him she was lying. The cafe was quiet, nearly empty. Cassie chose a table near the window, positioning Jake where she could see him at all times. The man from the hallway arrived precisely on time. He was older than she expected, silver at his temples, smile easy and practiced. He ordered espresso and sat without waiting for permission. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I'm Adrian Volkov." Cassie didn't respond. Volkov's gaze flicked to Jake, then back to her. "You see," he continued, "Dante Russo built his empire on certainty, predictable responses, fear, control. You disrupted that." Cassie's voice was steady despite the terror humming through her veins. "What do you want?" Volkov smiled. "Leverage." Before Cassie could move, two men appeared behind Jake, one hand on his shoulder. Not rough. Not yet. Cassie rose halfway from her chair. "Don't touch him." Volkov raised a placating hand. "Sit. If you scream, if you run, if you make a scene, he gets hurt. If you listen, he won't." Cassie sat. Volkov leaned closer. "We don't need you forever. Just long enough to send a message." "To Dante," Cassie said. "Yes." The world narrowed to a single, brutal clarity. Leaving Dante had not removed her from his world. It had made her accessible. Hours later, Cassie sat alone in a dim room, hands tied loosely enough to be a courtesy, tightly enough to be unmistakable. Jake was somewhere else safe. Volkov had promised. The promise meant nothing. The door opened. Dante stepped inside. For a moment, Cassie thought she was hallucinating him, her mind reaching for the only person who made sense in this nightmare. Then she saw the fury in his eyes, barely contained, burning through the careful control she'd come to recognize. "Are you hurt?" he asked immediately. She shook her head. "Jake alive," Dante said. "Unharmed." Cassie exhaled shakily, relief breaking through fear. "I told you to let me go." Dante moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. "I did," he said. "And the city punished you for it." Tears stung her eyes, anger rising to meet them. "You said distance wouldn't make me safe." "You were right." "And I said I wouldn't keep you," Dante replied. "That was my mistake." Before she could answer, Volkov's voice came from the doorway. "Touching reunion. But let's be clear, she's still mine, Dante, unless you're ready to bleed for her." Dante turned slowly. "Name your price." Volkov's smile widened. "Everything that matters." Cassie watched Dante then. Really watched him. The man who had always calculated, always chosen power over permission, stood on the edge of a decision that could destroy him. She realized with sudden, terrible clarity that this was the moment she had feared most. Not when she was taken, but when she became the reason he might lose himself. "Don't," she said softly. Dante didn't look at her. "I'm ending this." As Volkov laughed and the tension tightened to a breaking point, Cassie understood the truth that would change everything. Leaving Dante had never been the risk. Being loved by him was... The room held its breath. Cassie felt it first, the way silence tightened. The way Volkov's smile lingered too long, sharp with anticipation. This was the moment he had engineered. The pivot on which everything would turn. Dante Russo standing across from him. Fury barely leashed. A woman between them who was no longer collateral but currency. Volkov leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You see," he said pleasantly, "this is why I won. You're predictable. Dante, you protect what you claim." Dante's voice was calm, dangerously so. "She's not a possession." Volkov laughed softly. "No, then why did you come alone?" Cassie's heart hammered. Alone. The word echoed. She had expected violence, a raid, guns tearing through the walls. But Dante had walked in without an army, without spectacle. Just himself. That realization terrified her more than any threat. "Let her go," Dante said. "I'll give you what you want." Volkov's gaze flicked to Cassie. "What I want," he replied, "isn't something you can hand over. It's something you have to lose." The trap snapped shut in Cassie's mind. Volkov didn't want territory or money. He wanted Dante diminished, broken of certainty, a king forced to kneel. "Dante," Cassie said, her voice steady despite the fear burning through her. "Don't do this." He didn't look at her. "I'm already doing it." Volkov sighed theatrically. "You see, that devotion, it's expensive." He nodded once. The men holding Cassie loosened her restraints, not freeing her, but changing the terms. "She goes," Volkov said. "You stay. No retaliation, no revenge. You walk away smaller than you arrived." Cassie stared at Dante, understanding crashing over her in a wave so violent it stole her breath. "No," she said, "that's not a choice. That's a sentence." Dante finally looked at her then. The rage in his eyes softened into something infinitely worse resolve. "It's not yours to carry." "It is if you let them use me like this," Cassie shot back. Volkov rose, irritation flashing across his polished composure. "Enough. I've indulged this long enough." That was when everything unraveled. The lights cut out. Not dramatically, no explosion, no chaos, just darkness, clean and sudden. The room plunged into shadow, broken only by the emergency glow of exit signs. Cassie heard the sharp intake of breath, the scrape of chairs, the instinctive curse as Volkov's men reached for weapons that suddenly felt less certain. Dante moved. Cassie didn't see him go. She felt it. The shift in air. The controlled violence of a man who had never intended to negotiate. He hadn't come alone after all. He had come prepared to break every rule he had ever lived by. Gunfire cracked through the dark, short and precise. Not a massacre surgical. Screams followed, panic erupting as the balance of power collapsed. Hands grabbed Cassie, pulling her down, shielding her body as the world turned sharp and loud. "Stay down!" Dante's voice cut through the chaos, close, commanding. Someone shouted Volkov's name. Another voice answered in pain. The darkness lifted in fragments as emergency lights flickered back to life. It was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Cassie pushed herself upright, heart pounding, eyes searching. Dante stood near the doorway, gun lowered but ready, his suit torn, blood streaking his knuckles. She didn't know if it was his or someone else's. Volkov lay on the floor, restrained, fury and disbelief warring on his face. "You cheated," Volkov spat. Dante looked down at him, expression cold. "You miscalculated." Cassie stared at Dante, realization hitting her with stunning clarity. He hadn't chosen between power and her. He had burned the choice itself. Whatever alliances, whatever rules had kept men like Volkov in check, Dante had shattered them tonight. He crossed the room to her, checking her quickly, hands firm but gentle. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "Jake's safe," Dante said. Already gone. Relief collapsed her knees. Dante caught her before she fell, his arms solid around her back. For a moment, the world narrowed to that point of contact, the undeniable truth of him holding her together. "You destroyed your own balance for me," Cassie whispered. Dante's jaw tightened. "I destroyed it because it was already a lie." The aftermath came swiftly. Sirens, clean up. Orders barked into phones as Dante's network recalibrated in real time. Cassie watched it all with hollow awe. The city would feel this. Power vacuums didn't go unnoticed. Dante Russo had just declared war on the quiet structures that had tolerated him. Hours later, as dawn crept pale and hesitant over the skyline, Cassie sat beside Dante in a private car moving through streets that looked unchanged, indifferent. Jake was already safe, asleep somewhere far away. The crisis had passed, but its shadow lingered. "You didn't have to do that," Cassie said quietly. "Yes," Dante replied. "I did." She turned to him. "You could have traded me. I won't trade what I love," Dante said. The word landed between them, heavy and undeniable. Cassie swallowed. "Loving me will destroy you." Dante met her gaze, something fierce and unyielding there. "Then I'll rebuild." She searched his face, seeing the cost written into every line. He had crossed a threshold tonight that couldn't be uncrossed. There would be consequences: blood, loss, instability. And she was the reason. "I didn't want this," Cassie said. Dante's hand covered hers, grounding, unshakable. "Neither did I, but wanting has never changed reality." Silence settled, thick with everything unsaid. Cassie leaned back against the seat, exhaustion finally claiming her. She understood now that leaving Dante hadn't been an escape. Staying wasn't safety. There were no clean choices left. Only one truth remained. Dante Russo had broken his world for her, and nothing would ever be the same again. The city did not erupt the way Cassie expected it to. There were no headlines screaming Dante Russo's name, no sudden collapse of the skyline, no visible proof that something fundamental had shifted beneath Manhattan's polished surface. The streets still hummed, taxis still honked, cafes still filled with people who believed danger was something that happened to other lives. But Cassie felt it everywhere, in the pauses between phone calls, in the tightened security at every doorway, in the way Dante's world moved as if bracing for impact. Power didn't vanish when it cracked. It reformed, sharper, more honest. They returned to the Gramercy house just before sunrise. Jake was already there, asleep in a room guarded by men Cassie recognized from Dante's inner circle. She watched her brother for a long moment, memorizing the simple miracle of his safety, before closing the door quietly behind her. Dante waited in the study. He had changed clothes, cleaned the blood from his hands, but nothing softened the tension coiled through him. He stood by the window, city light catching the edges of his silhouette. A man who had crossed a line and was now standing on unfamiliar ground. Cassie didn't move closer. "You didn't have to bring me back here," she said. Dante turned. "You came. Because Jake is here," Cassie replied. "Not because this is resolved." A flicker of something approval, perhaps, crossed his expression. "Good," he said. "It isn't." She folded her arms, steadying herself. What happens now? Now, Dante said, we decide whether this continues. Cassie held his gaze. Under whose rules? A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. Yours. The word landed with unexpected weight. Cassie hadn't prepared for that. She had come ready to argue, to defend herself, to draw lines he would inevitably test. Instead, Dante stood there offering control to someone who had never wanted it. You burned half your alliances for me, she said quietly. Don't pretend this is charity. It's not. Dante replied, it's clarity. Cassie took a slow breath. Then listen carefully. If I stay, it's not as leverage, not as a symbol, not as something people can use to hurt you. They'll try anyway, Dante said. And I'll leave the moment you let them, Cassie countered. No secrets, no decisions made in my name, no protection that costs innocent people their lives. Dante's jaw tightened. You're asking me to be transparent in a world that survives on shadows. I'm asking you to choose, Cassie said. Not once, every day. Silence stretched between them, heavy and deliberate. Cassie wondered if she had misjudged him, if this was where he would finally say no, where the limits of his transformation would reveal themselves. Instead, Dante nodded. Agreed, he said. With one condition. Cassie's shoulders tensed. Which is, you don't disappear again, Dante said. If you leave, you tell me first. Cassie studied him. That's not protection. That's trust. Yes, Dante said. It is. The admission felt more dangerous than any threat. Cassie realized then that Dante wasn't asking her to stay because he needed leverage or validation. He was asking because he no longer trusted himself without her knowing where he stood. I can't promise forever, Cassie said. I'm not asking for it, Dante replied. I don't believe in promises that lie. That surprised her into a quiet laugh. You're very good at breaking things. And rebuilding. Dante said, if necessary. They didn't touch. Not yet. The distance between them felt deliberate, charged with restraint. Cassie knew how easily it could collapse, how one step could blur everything she was trying to protect. Later that afternoon, Dante walked her through the truths he had withheld, names, factions, the fragile equilibrium that had existed before Volkov tried to exploit her presence. Cassie listened, absorbing the weight of it, understanding at last the scale of what Dante had risked. He didn't soften it. He didn't justify it. He simply laid the pieces on the table and let her see the board. That night, as the house settled into its restless quiet, Cassie stood on the terrace overlooking the city. Dante joined her without a word, the space between them narrowing naturally, cautiously. You're not afraid, he said. Cassie shook her head. I am. I just refuse to let fear make my decisions. Dante considered that. That's why you survived. She glanced at him. No, I survived because you chose not to lose me. The truth of it hovered between them. Dante's gaze dropped to her mouth, then returned to her eyes, restraint evident in every line of him. This doesn't make us safe, Cassie said. No, Dante agreed. It makes us honest. They stood there together, not entwined, not distant, something newly defined forming in the space they shared. Cassie understood now that returning hadn't erased what had happened. It had reframed it. She wasn't stepping back into Dante's world as it was. She was helping shape what it would become. And for the first time since she had written that note on a receipt, Cassie felt the strange, unsettling sense that she wasn't merely surviving this story. She was choosing it. Peace, Cassie learned, was not silence. It was tension held in careful balance. The days following her return settled into a rhythm that felt almost unreal. Dante's world did not slow down, but it recalibrated. Meetings were shorter, voices were lower. Decisions carried weight that no longer hid behind habit. Cassie watched from the edges at first, absorbing the shape of this new reality, noticing how often Dante looked to her not for permission, but for alignment. That distinction mattered more than she had expected. She returned to work again, insisting on it despite the risks. Dante resisted once, then stopped. He arranged protection that remained invisible unless she searched for it. True to his word, he told her when plans shifted, when threats surfaced, when names moved from rumor to concern. Transparency did not make his world safer. It made it heavier. One evening, Cassie found Dante alone in the study, sleeves rolled, jacket discarded. The city reflected faintly in the glass behind him. He stood over a table scattered with documents and maps, lines drawn and redrawn, territories adjusted, alliances renamed. "You're dismantling it," she said softly. Dante didn't look up. "I'm refining it. For me, for us," he corrected. "If there is going to be a future, it can't be built on fear alone." Cassie stepped closer, eyes tracing the careful geometry of power laid bare. "You're making enemies. I already had them," Dante said. "Now they're honest." She watched him for a moment longer, then said what had been pressing against her chest all day. "This isn't over." "Is it?" Dante finally met her gaze. "No." The word settled quietly between them. The warning came 2 nights later, not through violence, through information. A name surfaced, one Dante had avoided speaking aloud since Volkov's fall. An architect of old loyalties, a man who believed restraint was weakness and sentiment a disease. He hadn't moved yet. That was what made him dangerous. Cassie listened as Dante explained, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she surprised him by asking, "What happens if you end this the way you always have?" Dante didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady. "Then it ends with blood. And if you don't, then it ends with uncertainty." Cassie nodded slowly. "I choose uncertainty." The decision was made without drama, without raised voices or ultimatums. Dante adjusted his strategy accordingly, stepping back where he once would have crushed, negotiating where he once would have threatened. The shift unsettled his enemies more than force ever had. But uncertainty cuts both ways. The attempt came quietly, almost gracefully. A routine drive, a familiar street, the kind of moment that felt safe precisely because it had happened so many times before. Cassie sensed it seconds before impact, the wrong rhythm of footsteps, the car that slowed instead of passing. Dante reacted instantly, pulling her back, shielding her as gunfire cracked the air. The world narrowed to movement and instinct, the controlled violence of survival. When it ended, the street lay stunned and empty, danger retreating as quickly as it had arrived. Cassie's hands shook as she pressed them against Dante's chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palms. "This is what I didn't want," she whispered. Dante closed his eyes briefly, forehead resting against hers. "I know." Later, safe behind locked doors and guarded silence, the weight of what had nearly happened settled in. Cassie sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. Dante stood a few steps away, restraint etched into his posture. "This ends," Cassie said quietly. "One way or another." Dante nodded. "Tomorrow." She looked up sharply. "You said uncertainty. And this," Dante replied, "is clarity." He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't ask for forgiveness or permission. He simply told her the truth. There was one final confrontation, one last decision that would determine whether this fragile future could exist. That night, Cassie didn't sleep. She lay awake listening to Dante's breathing beside her, memorizing the sound as if it might be taken from her. She thought about Jake, about normal mornings and unremarkable futures, about the life she had nearly lost, and the one she was still fighting to claim. When dawn came, pale and inevitable, Cassie rose quietly and dressed. Dante watched her without speaking. "Whatever happens," she said, "I don't regret choosing this." Dante reached for her hand, grounding, steady. "Neither do I." The city waited outside, dangerous and indifferent, unaware that 2 people stood on the edge of an ending that might finally allow something else to begin. Cassie stepped forward, heart steady despite the fear threading through her veins. This was the last line before peace, or the proof that peace was never meant to be clean. And for the first time, she didn't feel powerless facing it. The city did not know it was holding its breath. Morning broke over Manhattan with the same indifference it always had. Sunlight sliding between buildings, traffic resuming its familiar rhythm. Somewhere, people argued over coffee orders and missed trains, unaware that a final decision was unfolding quietly, without spectacle, in the spaces power rarely advertised. Cassie stood beside Dante on the terrace one last time before everything changed. The air was cool, sharp enough to clear the mind. Below them, the city stretched endlessly, dangerous and alive. "This is where I step away," Cassie said softly. Dante turned to her. He did not argue. He did not try to hold her with words. He had learned that love, the kind that endured, did not trap. "This is where I finish it," he replied. They didn't touch. Not yet. The restraint between them was deliberate, an unspoken promise that whatever came next would be chosen, not seized. The confrontation did not look like the movies. There was no grand showdown, no bodies piling up, no dramatic final bullet. It was a room filled with men who had underestimated the cost of their certainty. Dante walked in without threats, without rage. He spoke calmly, dismantling assumptions piece by piece, offering exits where there had once only been walls. The man who had waited in shadows, the last architect of the old order, expected violence. What he received was irrelevance. Dante took away his leverage, not his life. Accounts frozen. Allies turned cautious. Doors closed quietly. Power, Cassie would later realize, didn't always die screaming. Sometimes it simply found itself alone. When it was over, Dante did not feel victorious. He felt lighter. Cassie waited in the car, hands folded in her lap, heart steady despite everything. She had learned that fear no longer owned her. When Dante returned, his expression was calm, changed in a way she could not quite name. "It's done," he said. She searched his face. At what cost, Dante considered the question. Less than before. He answered, "More than I expected." Cassie nodded. "That's honest." They drove without speaking for a while, letting the city pass them by. For the first time since this story had begun, the silence felt earned. Life did not transform overnight. It rarely did. Weeks passed. The Gramercy house became quieter, less guarded, more lived in. Cassie returned to work, then slowly began building something new, classes she had once postponed. Ideas she had never allowed herself to imagine. Jake laughed more easily, complained about homework, argued about bedtime like a boy who had never come close to losing everything. Dante adjusted too. He delegated more. He walked away from meetings that once defined him. He learned, awkwardly at first, how to be present without control. Cassie noticed the way he listened now, not to calculate, but to understand. They did not rush into declarations. Love, they discovered, didn't need to be loud to be real. One evening, months later, Cassie found Dante in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, unsuccessfully attempting to cook. She leaned against the counter, watching him with quiet amusement. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," Dante replied. "I want to." The difference mattered. They ate together, imperfect food and shared laughter filling the space between them, afterward. They stepped onto the terrace, the city glowing below, familiar and less threatening now. Cassie rested her arms on the railing. "We never promised forever." Dante stood beside her. "I don't believe in forever." She glanced at him. "But you believe in this." "Yes," he said without hesitation. Cassie considered the man he had been, the man he was still becoming. "I won't disappear," she said, "but I won't stay out of fear either." Dante nodded. "Then we're aligned." He reached for her hand, not possessive, not urgent. Cassie laced her fingers through his, the gesture simple and deliberate. This was not a fairy tale. There were no guarantees. The city would remain dangerous. The past would never fully loosen its grip. But they had learned how to stand without armor between them, how to choose each other without erasing themselves. Later, as they walked through the park near the house, evening settling gently around them, Cassie felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Peace, not the absence of danger, not the promise of safety, but the presence of choice. Dante stopped walking and turned to her. "I won't promise you a perfect life," he said. Cassie smiled. "Good. I don't want one." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch careful, reverent. "I promise you honesty," Dante said, "and the space to walk away if you ever need it." Cassie held his gaze. "Then I promise to stay as long as staying is still a choice." They stood there for a moment longer, the city moving around them, indifferent and alive. Two people who had crossed fire and shadow now stood in something quieter, stronger. No vows, no illusions, just two lives, choosing each other again and again. And for the first time, that was enough.